Hey there, I'm srcmake, and welcome to the video on a programming language tier list specifically made for 2021. So basically, I've got this tier list right here, and we've got a bunch of programming languages listed out right here. We're going to go through every single one of them, and I'm going to go through their pros and cons, and we're going to rank them in which is most important to learn for 2021. Now, before we get started, I've got a few things to say. First of all, who this video is meant for. It's meant for if you want to know the differences between each language. As I said, I'm going to go through the pros and cons of each one, so you'll get an understanding of where each language is used and what the strengths and weaknesses of each one are. And if you're trying to decide which languages to learn, maybe you're a college grad or a new programmer, maybe you've got some time and you want to make a new side project and you want to learn the hip new up-and-coming languages, or maybe you're just trying to see which languages are most used in jobs in 2021. This video is meant for you. So before anything else gets said, I want to state everything I'm going to say is based on my personal opinion and my experience. This is based on what I've learned over the years and what I've seen when I've been job hunting. So before we get started with our tier list, I just want to go over some ground rules to make sure we're judging each language fairly. The first thing we care about for each language is how hard it is to actually learn that language and get good at that language. So the next thing that we care about is how good the language's libraries are. We want to see good standard libraries so that the maintainers of the language are constantly providing up-to-date support. And also, it would be a really good bonus if the language has a lot of support from the community where they're constantly sharing open source libraries to make it easier to plug into your own project and build from there. We don't want to build everything ourselves. So number 3 on our criteria list is how performant the language is, which basically means fast execution speed. Literally, the faster our program is, the more requests it can handle and the less server costs we spend, and so it saves money for us in the long run. Next up, we care about how easy it is to create a project for that language, which means a couple of things. One of them is file structure. It's really easy to write a hello world program or like one really simple file. But when we come to bigger projects, we want to be able to have manageable file structure and code readability. The other thing that matters for a project is tooling, which basically means how you build the language itself, how you import other people's libraries and dependencies. This is really important because we're trying to write these big, complicated programs that actually do good things. And finally, probably the most important thing is how many jobs there are for that language. So, with all of that said, let's go ahead and get to the tier list. Okay, so number 1 on the list is assembly, ASM. Assembly is going to be D tier. Assembly is sort of really important because a lot of languages compile into it and it's very low level, so it's kind of cool to understand. But assembly is very hard to learn. It's very close to machine code. And there really aren't that many jobs in assembly. There's just not that good of a probability of becoming a high-paid assembly programmer. And so for that, we're going to put it in D tier. So next up on the list, I think this symbol stands for Bash, and I'm going to put Bash on B tier. Bash is not a language that you would probably use by itself. It's more of a support language where you might use it in your project to help with building things or automating things, and you might see a lot of older projects use it. Okay, next up is C. C I'm going to put on D tier just like assembly. C is really fundamental. A lot of low-level things are built with C, like the Linux kernel. But C is not very pleasant to work with. When you jump into a C project, it's very, very strange. And the language is a bit dated, so there are not a lot of things that modern languages provide that make it easy to work with. I also don't think there are that many C jobs. Okay, next up is C++. C++ is a little bit of a weird one to rank. I'm going to put it in B tier. And I think C++ is very, very performant. I think it's got a lot of language support. C++ is what I use on my blog for all my interview questions and my algorithms. And the language allows you to do a lot with it, so you can think in really vast ways. Like you can think about things in terms of pointers and references, and you have all that control. But it's very hard to use, and it's a little bit niche when it comes to the job market. Next up, we've got C#. C# is an interesting one. I'm going to put it in C tier. I think the language C# is pretty good. I think it's got a lot of language support, both in terms of like the .NET framework and Microsoft ecosystem. You can deploy C# to Microsoft's Azure cloud cluster really easily. But I think C# is a little bit specialized. The way I would think about it is if you're applying to a job and they say they use C#, you can learn C# pretty easily. The syntax is really close to Java. If I was like an up-and-coming college grad, I would not buy into C# completely. I try to learn something else, one of the S or A tiers. C#, very good, but a little bit specialized. I have no idea what this symbol is, so we're going to skip it. I think this one is Fortran. I'm not even going to talk about it. We're just going to put it in F tier. Next up is Go. Go is very interesting. I'm going to put Go in A tier. So Go is a modern language. I think it was built in like 2007, 2008. It does concurrency really well, which is super important. The reality is modern computers have CPUs that have multiple cores. So if you can take advantage of those multiple cores, your program will run faster. And Go makes it very easy to do that. I think Go is very good. I think the language has a lot of tooling and language support. I think it's up and coming. I think it's really good for back-end APIs, and I've seen a lot of new modern jobs using it. So I'm going to put an A tier. The one thing that holds Go back a little bit is it's a garbage collected language, and so it's never going to have that super optimal performance that like C++ or Rust would have. I think a really famous example of this is Discord was using Go and they were running into some limitations, so they had to switch to Rust. And that's not to say Go is bad. I think for the average company and use case, Go is perfectly acceptable. But for like the really huge volume companies, they might want to switch to something a bit more performant where it matters. Okay, moving on. I don't know what this symbol is. I see this one is HTML5, and we are going to rank that nowhere because HTML is not a programming language. Next up is Java. Java we are going to put in S tier. Going to keep it really simple. Java is an older language, but it's very fast. The language is pretty easy to read, and it's got a lot of library support. It's got a lot of tooling. A lot of mid-tier companies use Java, so there are a lot of jobs there. The other big use case besides backend APIs for Java is Android. And so just all around Java is great. There really aren't too many flaws with Java that you can nitpick at, so we have to put in S tier. It's just really that good. So next up on the list is JavaScript, and JavaScript we will begrudgingly put in A tier. So the language syntax of JavaScript is really easy to use, really easy to read. You can understand it very quickly. The language is a bit janky in that it does some sort of weird things, and it's not like the fastest execution speed, but JavaScript is just used in so many places and it's got so many use cases that we have to rank it very highly. Literally every web browser in 2021 is going to be using JavaScript in some form. You can either use it together with some basic HTML and CSS and like JavaScript to get things rolling, or you could have a single page application using React or Angular, or you could even use it on the back end with Node.js, and that's like really easy to use too. And it's so easy to spin up. That's just what I love to use for my quick websites. I think there are a lot of JavaScript jobs, and the language is easy to use, so we have to put in A tier. Next up is Kotlin. Kotlin is used in Android applications, basically an easier way than using Java. I think Kotlin is very good, and if you're using an Android app, you should use Kotlin. You shouldn't use Java if you can, because it's just much easier. If I'm telling you to learn Kotlin, I'm basically telling you to be an Android developer, and because it's got that specialized use case, we have to put it in C tier. Okay, I have no idea what these two symbols are, so we're going to skip them. Lua I have actually used in the past for some cross-platform applications. I think it's a really easy language to use, but I can't recommend it, so we're just going to put it in F tier. MATLAB I really don't want to rank. We'll just put it in F tier. MySQL is not a programming language, and we're going to create a double standard here. I said HTML5 was not a programming language, so I didn't rank it. But MySQL is like so important that we're going to put it in B tier with like the utilities like Bash. So basically in computer science, you need to be storing data somewhere, and in most cases, that's going to be a database, especially when it comes to the web and APIs, and you've got like user information that you need to persist that gets stored in a database. And the way you query and interact with that database is using MySQL. Now, for the most part, inside of a programming language, you're going to be using some sort of ORM most of the time that's going to sort of hold your hand and take care of all the hard work so that you don't have to construct queries yourself. But if you know MySQL, or really just SQL in general, then you can connect to the database and you can run queries yourself and do interesting things that you need to, like pulling data or seeing what's going on. And it's just really powerful. And it's really not like a full-featured programming language. You could literally just learn this in a few hours and then Google for the syntax afterward if you forget anything. It's important to know if you're a backend API developer, but even if you're like on the front end and you want to see what's going on, very, very important and good. So MySQL B tier. Perl, I have no idea. I don't know why you would use Perl in 2021. We're going to put it in F tier. Next up is PHP. PHP, we're going to put in C tier. So PHP is this weird case where it's sort of this older thing, and there might be a few companies that originally built their websites in PHP, and now they have to deal with that for the rest of their lives. And I think there are a few jobs that use PHP. I think it's an okay programming language. I just don't think it's a thing that you would want to learn if you've got like a fresh start in life. So I'm going to put PHP in C tier only because I think there are a few jobs. I think if you're using the language, you might learn a thing or two from it, and there are a few opportunities. It's just not the greatest thing. Okay, next up I think is Shell, which is basically, I'm going to say the same thing about it as Bash, where you might want to learn it for some utility and some from helper, but it's not really even a programming language. So there, learn your Linux commands if you need to. Next up is Python, and Python is unquestionably S tier. And you know what? I'm even going to put it ahead of Java. So here's my rationale. Python is not the fastest execution speed, we can get that out of the way, but it is very readable. Reading Python code is probably easier than reading the English language. Honestly, it's like pseudocode. Python is really powerful in that it has a lot of standard library support, and a lot of people work with Python. I don't know if I mentioned this, by the way, but Python, Java, and C++ are the three languages that you want to be doing your interview questions in and learning algorithms in, because the language syntax is easy to read and they've got a lot of standard library support. So Python's got that going for it. If you know Python, you can breeze through interview questions very quickly. I think the utilities of Python are very vast. You can use Python in backend APIs like Django. You can use it in scripting instead of using Bash. I think the real money maker that's very popular in 2021 is data science and machine learning, and Python is very popular for that. You can train models and do a lot of things in Python. And those are like some of the hottest up-and-coming jobs that if I was in college, I think data science would be the thing that I would try to learn because it's just so powerful, and a lot of companies are accumulating so much data that they need to analyze and do things with, and Python is the thing that they do that with. And Python's a really easy language. So we're going to put Python in S tier. It's the #1 language so far. Okay, moving on, we've got Ruby. Ruby I'm also going to put in C tier, kind of the same reason as PHP, but I'm going to rank it ahead of PHP. Ruby as a programming language is okay. I'm actually not a fan of it personally. I'm not a fan of the conventions, but it's fine. So the thing that I have a problem with is Ruby on the Rails, which is basically the main use case of using Ruby. Ruby on the Rails makes it really easy to spin an app up with, which basically means an API or a website or whatever you want. And it's really powerful if you don't know what you're doing and you want things done quickly. But if you do know what you're doing, then it's a problem because it hides so much behind the scenes that you might not become a better programmer. And it's also like a little bit hard to read if you're coming in from a different sort of programming language. I know personally I had a job in the past where they used Ruby on the Rails and I had to learn it because it's part of the job, and I really didn't like it. There was like so much mysterious stuff going on, and the language syntax was just so weird with the ORM and the API and the way the routing was happening. But I do think there are a lot of jobs with Ruby on the Rails because a lot of people did make those quick websites using Ruby, and so they sort of have to live with it now. And so those jobs are out there. I also think you might learn a thing or two if you spend some time with Ruby, but I think if you spend your time in like one of the S or A tier languages, you might be better suited. So I'm going to put Ruby on C tier. It's okay, and there are a few jobs, but there are better things to learn. Up next is R. R, I have no idea, so I'm just going to put an F tier. I'm sorry. When you compare it to these other languages, it wouldn't rank highly anyway. The next up, which you can't really see, is Rust. Rust is going to be A tier. So Rust is a very performant language. It's like C++, except easier. The language is very modern. Rust is one of the languages that I want to learn this year. I think there are a few Rust jobs out there, but it's a bit harder to find compared to like the website building languages like Ruby, PHP, JavaScript, even Go. But overall, Rust is just a really great language, and so we're going to rank it on A tier. Next up is Swift. Swift, I'm going to put in C tier along with the other, what I would call specialized languages. So what's the use case for using Swift? Well, it's really only to build iOS applications. That's basically it. And because of that, it's too specialized, and so I can't rank it higher. There are quite a few iOS jobs. A lot of companies do want apps built for them. But this is a programming language tier list, and so if you compare the language to like other ones, these ones are just better as languages. And finally, there's Visual Basic. You can do some things in Visual Basic, and I think an interesting use case is using it in spreadsheets. I'm just going to put it in D tier. Okay, and so this is our programming language tier list. Our S tier consists of Python and Java. Those are really good languages. Lots of library support, lots of jobs. And if you're trying to make a new project or learn something for a job, I would learn these. Next up in A tier, we've got Go, JavaScript, and Rust. These are really good languages, lots of benefits to them, but they're not like the perfect languages. There's a lot of upside to these languages, and so I would spend time learning them because I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities in A tier in the future. So keep an eye on them. B tier is sort of like utilities, and then there's C++. C tier is sort of specialized, C#, Kotlin, Swift, Ruby, PHP. I would learn those if the job requires them, but I wouldn't go out of my way to learn them and think I'm studying programming in like this general sense that's beneficial to me. These languages are mostly like on-the-job sort of things, I would say. Next up is D tier, Assembly, C, and Visual Basic. If you want to spend a little bit of time learning them just to see what's going on, it would be somewhat useful, but I wouldn't go out of my way to learn them. And then F tier is like whatever. Okay, so there was one language that was not on this tier list that is my personal favorite. I think there's a ton of upside in this language, and I would rank it on A tier, and that is Elixir. So Elixir is really interesting because the language is very similar to Ruby, but the powerful thing about it is it can run on the Erlang VM, which is really good for concurrency. And it's got some really interesting concepts that will make you think in like a sort of different way. So if I were to start a side project, or if I was trying to get some experience on the side for like some specialized jobs, Elixir would be what I would try to learn. And once again, I think Elixir is A tier. Elixir is one of the 3 languages that I want to learn this year, along with Rust and Go. So to conclude, we made a tier list for programming languages in 2021. The truth is, all of these languages are very good. We looked at basically the best of the best. If you think I ranked some language lower or higher than it should be, feel free to leave a comment below and let me know. And hopefully we can spend this year learning a lot of new languages and building a lot of new projects. Make sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel, like this video, leave a comment, follow me on Twitter and other social medias. I'm srcmake. Thanks for watching.